Till now we saw what side effects were, and we had a few examples. They are still on the screen. DOM manipulation, fetching data, DOM APIs like local storage, and doing intervals and timeouts. I forgot one more important thing is taking DOM events. For example, I want to listen the clicks on this whole document rather than a single button or something. Why is this not working properly? Yeah. So let's say I don't want to listen to the clicks on the button, but rather on the whole page. We still need DOM events. It's something similar to how we were manipulating whenever we are trying to talk to the DOM APIs. DOM events actually should be part of uh, DOM APIs. Clicks on whole page as an example, etc. But we are now going to focus on doing fetch data. I am going to clear out most of the code here. Actually, let me just go out and clear all of the code so that there is no confusion. Let me just return something for the app to actually work. I'm going to put a div, put a hello inside of the div. So we start fresh. We should only have a hello being returned on the page when it loads. Perfect. Okay. So let's say I have this API, which is the dog API. Let me also go and refresh this page. I have an API, which is the dog API. And if you hit this endpoint, let's just go and try hitting this endpoint. It will give us a message and a status. The status tells us, I'll zoom first. Yeah, the status tells us if the request was successful or not, and the message gives us an image of a dog. Let's see on the API, if I fetch a new one, I get a new image of the dog every time I am fetching. I'm pressing on the button fetch. And we sort of want to replicate this sort of an action that if I click on a button, I want to have a new dog image, right? So let's go on here. And the first thing I'm going to do here is put a button. Fetch me doggos. Okay, so on this button, we have fetch me doggos, and somehow I want to fetch a picture of a dog here, right? How do we do this? We have an API endpoint. How do we start fetching data? So one way of doing this, let me just clear the console, and is using the fetch API. So I'm going to put fetch here. If you have used Axios before or KY or something like that, any of those, they work all pretty similar, but we are going to deal with fetch. Whenever we start fetching, we get a promise, so we have to do it then. We get some response body, and we do know in our case our response body has to deal with JSON. So I'm going to do response.json so that we encode it. And then finally, when I get the data, I want to do console log of that data. This will also work, but this exactly means like this. I do console log and I go for my data. It says the promise was pending. When the promise got resolved, I got a message and I got the success status. So now I basically know how to fetch this data. And if I go, I need to start fetching this data somehow. Let me just make this as a function here. Const fetch dog images is equal to, and inside of that I can just return my fetching function. Right? Does it make sense? It is exactly like if I go and copy paste this in the console. In the console we were practicing before. Yeah, I'm gonna go paste this function, and whenever I call this function, I'll get one image. This is coming of the breed Akita. Let's call the dog again, and now we are getting another breed called Blue Tick. Whenever I call this function, I will get a new dog image. This is coming from for Terrier Australian. Actually, I don't know what this dog looks like. Let me just open this up. Oh, cute. Okay, so anyway, now we know that this function, whenever we click, we can get some image out. Let me bring this function actually inside of here. It still doesn't matter. It's still a function. We can put it inside of another function. That's the beauty. Uh, how do we start using? So I know that whenever I do a on click on the button here and I give this function, um, I will start logging the data. So let's try now. When I do on click, it was gonna call this function, and what this function essentially does is doing a console log of the data it gets. So if I do this on my console, now I have a message. Let me zoom this. Oh, zooming this goes bad. So you have to believe me that on my console, I have a message and a status. And this one comes for the American Terrier. If I click again, I got an Australian Shepherd. If I click again, I get a Greyhound. But I'm still not being able to display the image, right? Because I somehow need to put an image tag here, and the alt will be doggos, as it's going to be images of doggos. um, Somehow I need to put the source, and when I see the source, this source is coming from the message of the response that we get from the network. So this data contains a property called message, and I'm gonna just log that in now. So we're only going to log the message, and if I see the message, now I get all the image URLs. Somehow this thing has to be put in here. And whenever we need to do something like that, we need to raise it to a common state. So I'm going to do const dog image URL, comma, set dog image URL is equal to set state. And initially the image URL I can leave as null, which essentially means I can just completely remove this. And the dog image URL, I can then pass the image URL here, but since it is null, it'll still be crashing. So we will have something doesn't look right. Set state is not defined. How is it not? Let this boot up completely. Say app to use set state. We put the fetching function and we put the source image URL. Yeah, this should work. If it's not working, it's sort of misbehaving at this point. We probably have to completely refresh this. Let me open this up again. React.setState is not a function. This is odd. Let me just refresh the page and see what was going wrong. Sometimes with Code Sandbox, if you keep changing a lot, it tries to hot reload and gets messed up. Hmm. Sorry, it's not set state, it's use state. What am I even doing? Okay, use state. Never mind. Yeah, that was a silly mistake. Good that we got it. There are currently two problems. First of all, we are still not setting the dog image. Whenever I click, I get this image in the console, which is simple. We can go and fix that easily. The other thing is initially the image is null and I'm having this broken image. So we gotta start solving these both these problems. So the first problem is set dog image URL. I know how to set this state, and then this state is what's going to render the image. So on the button click, I can just go and say, hey, whenever you finally get the data, set the dog image URL. So I'm gonna again go refresh. Now I say fetch me doco and I get an image. Similarly, if I go click this button again, there will be another fetch request and I'll get another image. Let's see that in the main tab as well. I'll open this in a new tab. And let's also look at the network logs. So initially we did not fetch any image and that's why this is broken. Why is this broken again? Because initially the value is null. Even if we don't type it, it's implicitly null. And null being source of an image, it will show a placeholder. Now, when I first click on fetch me docos, I get this, I hit this image URL endpoint, and then I also load this image. The similar thing will happen if I press this again. I'll hit the endpoint to get the image, and then I'll load the image, and so on and so on. Let's see how we can fix the other issue. Now, the one thing before we start fixing that is this API right now works. It right now works pretty well. If I go and put it and keep getting a new image, but it might also fail at certain point. Maybe our internet is down, the user's internet is down, or this website is down, and we need to gracefully handle that in our application. What we can do is we can use a catch statement, and this catch statement will return us an error. This is when the API has gone through any sort of an error. And if the image has an error, I actually want to not show the image and show a message here and say something went wrong, right? Now I have to choose which thing to display when, right? Because it could either be an error or I have the actual data and I can show an image. So somehow we need here to know that there has been an error or not. And I'm gonna go again and make another state, has error and set error. And since I do not care about the error message for now, I only choose to say that if I have an error or if I don't. And if you have something like that, you're talking about booleans, right? Is there something or not? Is it true or not? So I'm going to initially say that there are no errors. So I can just simply go and remove that. And in my error function, I'm going to say yes, because I am doing a catch message. So I'm going to set the errors to true. So if the image has error, then I want to display that. And for that, we already know how to conditionally display something. We're going to do the variable interpolated with an and. So if now our API hits an error, our image will show something went wrong. And if it doesn't have error, which means we can do like this, that it does not have error, and then display the image. So when I do this, I'm still able to work through my app. There's also one more thing whenever you do data fetching, is that this image might be loading at one point and you do not know that. Right now we are saying, hey, we want to fetch an image, and at the very next moment we are trying to get this image, but this API might get really, really slow, or the point that my internet gets really slow and I do not know what is happening. For example, let me go and make my internet slow 3G, and let me click on this button and try to fetch the image. Now we have clicked on this button and the user is sitting for 5 seconds or more till the image actually comes up on the screen. Let's see this again. I click this button, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's going to take more around 10 seconds for the complete image to download and load on your screen. And that's a lot of amount of time without telling the user that something is actually happening in the background, and it gives a very bad UX. The user might just click 10 times because the person is not seeing any results. For that, we need another state, const loading, or rather call it is loading, and then we put a set loading. And again, since this is a Boolean value, I'm going to treat this state as a Boolean because we do not care about anything else. We just want to know if it is loading or not. So is it loading is true or not, true or false. So I'm going to put initially the image is not going to be loading. When is the image going to start loading? Well, as soon as we start calling the fetch function, right? So whenever we call the fetch doc image function, I'm going to say set loading to true. When we actually finally have the data, I want to say that, hey, we finally have the data, which means our function has worked and our API has responded, so it is not anymore loading. So I'm going to say set loading false. Similarly, when the API has some errors, which means the API did actually hit the server, or it did not, but it actually finished doing whatever it wanted to and it has stopped loading. So I'm going to say set loading false again. Now let's try to use this loading variable. I am going to put the loading variable on top and say if something is loading, then say loading as the message. Otherwise, show me all of this. Or actually, let's just keep it like that. If it is loading, then just show the loading message. Let's put this in a paragraph tag as well, so that at least the user knows that something is happening on our screens. So let's see how it works. Now when I click this button, I get this loading. Just for a fraction of a second, I see this word loading here. This effect is more prevalent if we... Oh, why is my screen not going full? Exit full screen. Oh, wow. Okay, so this was the API where we made it slow, right? And if I go and say fetch, it is now showing me loading. So the user at least knows that something is happening while the image is getting loaded. While the API is being called, we get this nice little message that it is loading and the user can wait till the whole data of that image comes back. So this is the essence of fetching data. We are now fetching data on when the button is clicked. Note that we have still not solved this problem where we initially get this empty image, but we're gonna tackle it soon. But the main concept here is whenever you are fetching data, you have to always think of three things. First is the data. Second, if it's loading. Second, if it's loading. Let me just move it on top. And the third thing is catching the errors. Always remember, whenever you're fetching data, you have to make these three states of whether you have the data or not, whether your fetching is still loading or has it completed, and the third thing, if we have errors or not. It is quite essential. This is called as, I think they call it remote data fetching pattern. So all data fetching done via fetch, Axios, whatever you choose, has to have three things. First, we need a state for data. That is the response of the API call. We need another state for knowing if the API call is loading or has it finished loading. And third, we need a state to keep the errors. If the API call has errors or not, in the end, when we fetch the data, when we are fetching through an API call, it might result in a data or it might result in an error, and we have to take that into account. And meanwhile, the API state will always be in a loading state. So these are the three important things that you have to always do, and cannot emphasize on this more. If you do this, you will be reducing a lot less bugs and you will be giving your users a really good experience. This is the basic essence of doing a data fetch on a button click. Now in the next video, we're gonna see how we can automate this data fetch on page loading and also include button click.